Good morning. For those of you I haven't met, I am Betty Nuxall. I serve as chair of our worship committee. I am one of the worship assistants for today's service, along with Bob Nuxall, a member of our board of trustees. On behalf of my fellow members and the ministers of our congregation, it is my pleasure to welcome you today to the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rock. As a Unitarian Universalist congregation, we believe that the spirit of life, called by many names, is known to each of us uniquely. As people of the Unitarian Universalist tradition, our task is to encourage one another in our individual transformation so that we might help what is good in this world to grow and thrive. If you are a newcomer visiting us today, know that we are glad you are here. If you'd like more information about Unitarian Universalism and this congregation, we invite you to complete one of the blue visitor information cards. If you have a youngster with you who would appreciate something to do with his or her hands, we have in the rear of the sanctuary some child-friendly items in cloth bags. An usher can assist you in finding one. Childcare is also available from 9:30 to 12:30 in room 2, and our special program, Art in the Nature of the Rock, is still available at this time in room 15. The 2018-19 religious education classes begin on Homecoming Sunday, September 16th. Please complete registration by August 17th. We have also in the rear of the worship room hearing assistant devices should one make your experience in this service more comfortable. Please feel free to seek one out. Immediately after the service, we will convene in the social hall just across the lobby for our UU Cafe, where lunch can be purchased at a modest price. If you're joining us for the first time, we hope that you will allow us to treat you to lunch. Please stop at the welcome table in the lobby to receive your gold guest ticket. If you don't have time for lunch today, we'll hope you'll be able to stay for coffee and a little time for fellowship. And now, before we enter into our service, I have a few announcements to share with you. As I do, I encourage you to take this time to turn off your cell phones and electronic devices. We would like to remind you of our ongoing used clothing, non-perishable food, and school supply collections, for which we ask you to please be generous. In your order of service, you will find a calendar and many announcements of these and other activities and programs. We hope that you will take the time to read through them and that you will feel invited to attend the events you find listed there. If you have any questions about any of those events, please speak to Membership Coordinator Ben Borton or call our main office this week. And now it is my privilege to welcome guest speaker, Deacon DeMartino, Director of Priest Wellness for the Archdiocese of New York. In addition, he is active in meeting facilitation and supervision of faith-based organizations and their leadership teams, seminary teaching, congregational social ministry team leadership, and retreat work. His training centers on behavioral health, including addiction prevention and governance leadership. He will be speaking today on the topic, I have heard my people's cry of wailing, the prayer that God cannot fail to hear. And now, in the spirit of hospitality, let us take a moment to greet our neighbor and talk to those closest to us.
bind me to you. I look far, I forget you, and I'm lost. I lift my hands to you, I kneel toward my heart. I have no other home. My love is here. I end the day in mercy that I wasted in despair. Bind me to you, I fall away. Bind me, ease of my heart. Bind me to your love. Gentle things you return to me, and duties that are sweet. And you say, I am in this heart. I and my name are here. Everywhere the blades turn, in every thought the butchery, and it is raw where I wander. But you hide me in the shelter of your name, and you open the hardness to tears. The drifting is to you, and the swell of suffering breaks to you. You draw me back to close my eyes, to bless your name in speechlessness. Blessed are you in the smallness of your whispering. Blessed are you who speaks to the unworthy. You are with me still, even though I have been removed and my place does not recognize me, even though I have filled my heart with stones. And my beloved says, I will wait a little while behind this curtain. No, I have waited too long. You are with me still, though I scorched away the tears of return in the forced light of victory. Your rebuke still comforts me. You signify yourself among the dangers, saying, use this fear to know me. Fix this exile toward my return. Though I am unwept, it is your judgment parches me. Though the praises for you are under ban, it is the balance of your mercy. And you are with me still, saying, search this out. It is you who have hidden yourself, saying, clear me in your troubled heart, saying, I will come to you, saying, I am here. Though I add membrane to membrane against your light, and heap up cities on the husk of your rebuke, when the sun and the moon are shining in the other pan, and you advance me through the solitude by such a kind degree, and you create the world before my eyes, and the one who hides in self-disgrace cannot say amen. O slow to anger, you are with me still.
I invite Bob Nuxall to come forward to light our chalice this morning. We hallow this time together by kindling the flame of our chalice, the symbol of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. Please stand as you are willing and able, and join in singing hymn number 360, Here We Have Gathered. Please remain standing for the words and song of affirmation printed in the order of service. Love is the doctrine of this congregation. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need. This do we affirm and covenant with each other.
If you are grateful for the presence of Unitarian Universalism in this world and for this congregation, become its advocates. If you are concerned for the future of our faith, share our message. If our principles resonate deep within you, give to this religious tradition your devotion. Our tradition of Unitarian Universalism cannot survive without your devotion and your generosity. Would the ushers please come forward to accept this morning's offering?
A reading from the book of Matthew, the judgment of the nations. When God ends all human time and calls all the nations together for judgment. God will assemble them before God. And God will separate them as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And God will place the sheep on God's right and the goats on God's left. And then God will say, "Come, you who are blessed, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Ill, and you cared for me. In prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer and say, "God, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you ill or in prison and visit you?" And God will say in reply, "Amen, I say to you, whatever you did for one of these least sisters and brothers of mine, you did for me."
I invite any of you who would like to light candles of joy or sorrow to come forward now in the quiet of this moment, as all of us join them in silence, focusing our intentions on these candles of celebration and concern.
Pastoral reflection on downward mobility. I invite you to discover your vocation in downward mobility. It's a scary request because we live in a world that is obsessed with wealth and security and prestige and upward mobility. But we are called to teach solidarity, to walk with the victims and the survivors, to serve and to love. And so I offer this for you to consider downward mobility. And I would say that in this enterprise, there is a great deal of hope. Have the courage to lose control. Have the courage to feel useless. Have the courage to listen. Have the courage to receive. Have the courage to let your heart be broken. Have the courage to feel. Have the courage to fall in love. Have the courage to get ruined for life by those made poor. And have the courage to make a friend. Sisters and brothers, I have heard my people's cry of wailing, the prayer that God cannot fail to hear. When I was privileged to be with you last summer, I shared some reflections on the spirituality of poverty. And I talked about the 4 interior movements that we can experience when we take the risk and we open our hearts and reflect on the poverty that is around us, both in our own hearts and our communities and in the world around us. And I talked about those 4 interior movements: compassion, and how that is strengthened when we spend time reflecting on poverty; advocacy, which is that initial response we have to want to do something about this; humility, when we begin to understand that we don't have the answers and that all of our wealth and materialism does not give us the right to tell others how to be in this world. And then that 4th movement, solidarity, in which we begin to understand that it's not a question of they and us, but a question of we. And it sounds almost corny, but that's an important spiritual reality. This morning, I'd like to look more fundamentally and say, well, what gives us the foundation to even talk about that? And then I'd like to move also into another aspect and say, well, how ought we to respond as people of solidarity? And I expect that many of the things that I'm about to share with you are things that you already know. And I can say that because I have some experience of being with your congregation and hearing some of the stories of how you respond. So I am not here today in arrogance to tell you what to believe or how to think, but to remind us of what our common foundation is and to what we are asked to do. And so we begin at the beginning, and that beginning is with our shared understanding of how we were created and how we came into this world. And for most of us in our traditions, we think about the book of Genesis, and at least in the West, and the creation of all that life that is around us. And we understand from reflecting on that story that there is a foundation that goes something like this. There is a power that's greater than ourselves. And that power is the creative force that calls all life into being. And that life is not an accident or just a random scientific process. It is a conscious choice of the Creator. And that we refer to that creative force, that Creator, as God. And we understand that we are not the gods, but that God does exist, and that there is only one. And in the UU tradition, the spirit of life known to each person uniquely. We just prayed on that at the beginning of our worship service. And further, we can say that the essential essence of God is relationship. That God is deeply involved in all of creation, and that God is knowable and wishes to accompany us in our lives. And so as we reflect on that story of God's creation, we further say that the essence of that relationship is love. That is the energy that is the essential force of the Creator, the energy that binds us to God, and the energy that gives us the capacity, if we are willing to take the risk, to know ourselves and to know each other and to be in community with one another. And further, we understand that love is relational, not isolative, that it is open and giving and not violent and manipulative in its nature. And then here's the most important part, sisters and brothers. If you follow what I'm saying, then we have to accept the reality that God created us in God's own image and likeness, and that what dwells within us is that energy of love, and that even God, at the end of God's creation, looked upon all the life that had been created and said, "It is good," not flawed, not evil, not bad. God looked at everything God had made, and God found it very good. And so we are invited into this relationship, into this intimacy with love, with ourselves, with each other, and with our Creator. And in the UU tradition, you say to encourage one another in our individual transformation so that we might help what is good in this world grow and thrive. We have a shared understanding of this reality. We have been given the freedom to know ourselves, to develop our self-awareness. We have been given the invitation over and over again to know God. And we have been given the freedom to accept this invitation from our creative and loving God, and as God speaks to us in our lives and in our interactions with each other. We've been given the invitation, and we have the freedom to say yes to that invitation or the freedom to reject it. And when we reject that invitation, there are always consequences, just as when we accept that invitation, there are consequences. All religious systems, both Western and indigenous, reflect these core understandings of our Creator as loving and giving and desiring for us to be in relationship, in healthy relationship with our Creator and with each other. And hear the words that we often speak to each other but struggle to accept and to live by. All of us are loved. All of us are of value and worth. We all have intrinsic dignity by virtue of being created in the image and likeness of God. We all are worthy of being invited into peaceful relationships and to be supported to be in those relationships of peace, to share equally in the resources and the bounty of human work and the gifts of our earth which is, of course, our common home. This is who we really are. This is the authentic fullness of our human experience. And it is God's vision for us, both as persons and as communities. And this is the choice that God longs for us to embrace. And this is the painful cry that God hears when we do not choose to embrace this understanding. Because when we don't structure our families and our communities in the manner in which God invites, in love, acceptance, equality, inclusiveness, collaboration, then suffering always emerges. There is no other consequence of that rejection but suffering. And we create suffering by the choices we make. It is not some external decision of our creating God or some vengeful act on his part. We make the choices. We exercise our freedom. And when we don't embrace each other in the loving way that we were created, suffering emerges. And we also destroy each other, our communities, and we poison our earth. And that's the anguished prayer that God cannot fail to hear, that cries out in wailing. And so, sisters and brothers, the challenge before us is, how are we to respond to this suffering? How are we to open our eyes and be who we really are? And how are we to resist the temptation to lock ourselves away in our own material comfort and to close our eyes to the suffering that we have participated in, either directly or indirectly? Because God responds to the suffering in our human experience, in our human communities, with grief, not with rage. And over the millennia, God has sent along prophets, holy and wise women and men, who have tried to remind us by their witness and by their words, by their actions and by their sacrifices, that we have lost our way. And in almost every tradition, both formal and informal, the role of the prophet is to stand before the community and believers and shout out and say, "You've lost your way," and to point the way back. And our holy texts in all traditions are full of these stories. Full of the stories of God saying, "Come home to my loving intimacy. Come home to the orientation of community that I have laid out for you from the beginning, which is a community of equality and inclusiveness, a community of love and mercy." And if we reflect on this, we have to admit that we have a long history of not listening to this call to continual conversion of our hearts and our communities. We have a long history of not sharing equally our resources. We have a long history of judging individuals as different and not worthy and not equal, and therefore acceptable to be hurt or destroyed or to be made poor and then allowed to suffer. We have a long history of manipulation and exploitation and humiliation of both persons, people, and our earth, our common home. We haven't exactly been the best examples here in the West of what God has called us into. And that's why I shared with you those two poems from Leonard Cohen, one of our great Jewish mystics. He reminds us of the consequences of our choices. The emptiness, the confusion, the feelings of being lost. But he also reminds us of God's promises. No matter what, God binds us to God. And no matter what, God calls us home and is with us. How can God not be with us? God is in our hearts. We're created in God's image and likeness. Most of our religious systems call us to somehow or other fix this suffering. And we hear about it in different ways. We hear about the individual fix to suffering, which is to take those who have behaved badly and to punish them, to sanction the person, instead of looking at the causes and the context of that inappropriate behavior. We have over the millennia waged wars in God's name in the hopes that those we've identified as not human enough we can destroy by genocide, by violence, slow or not so slow. And we have also said in many of our spiritual traditions that the suffering of others is somehow or other the will of God. And we rationalize the inequality, the inequalities. We rationalize the racism and the sexism and the human rights violations. We rationalize the economic inequalities by saying, well, after all, this must be God's will for you because this is what you were born into, or these are the choices that you've made, and now you're dealing with the consequences. But don't worry, have faith, because in the next life you will be rewarded. In the next life, everything's going to be fine. Sisters and brothers, I believe that we are called to reject all of these fixes as not essential to who we are, not appropriate postures of response, and not at all helpful to help in our quest to build human communities that are just. I believe that what we are called to instead is to heal wounds, to unite what has fallen apart, to bring home with great celebration all peoples and systems who have lost their way. And if you can accept that, even hold your mind and your heart open to that for a few minutes, the essential question becomes, how do we do this? How do we step away from the ways we typically behave in those fixes that I outlined, or in our numbness to the suffering around us? And how do we do that? And I think the answer to that question is twofold. And as I mentioned before, in your congregation, you're not strangers to trying to answer the question. The first answer comes to us from the reading from Matthew. By being merciful, compassionate, and loving towards those who have been made poor in body, mind, and spirit. And we hear the list, right? In some traditions, we call these the works of mercy. Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, visit the imprisoned, shelter the homeless, visit the sick, and bury the dead. If you think about the social justice ministries of your congregation, you're responding. But it's never enough to be satisfied with what we're doing. God calls us and challenges us to do more, to do as much as we possibly can. And we need to be reminded from time to time that those works of mercy need to be first and foremost the ways that we build more just human communities. And then we have the other works of mercy, which are a little more subtle and not usually spoken about. Counsel the doubtful. When we spend time listening to our sisters and brothers who are struggling in body, mind, and spirit, fearful, anxious, unclear, unsure. In your tradition, you acknowledge that to be on the journey of faith is to also experience doubt. And so we have an obligation to counsel the doubtful, to instruct those who do not understand, to share with the people around us, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is why I believe what I believe. And you can use different words to describe that, but we are called to be witnesses of the values of our traditions and to know enough about how to explain what we believe and to have the courage and the strength to enter into that dialogue. Some of us do that more publicly than others. Some of us have the gift of articulation more so than others. But we all ought to remember that we are called to instruct those who do not understand. We are also called to accountability with one another. In the old language, to admonish the sinners, to hold ourselves and each other accountable for our behavior, but to do so in a spirit of just mercy and forgiveness. That's very, very challenging, sisters and brothers, but that's what's before us. to comfort the afflicted, to use the structures and communities around us to provide care and support in both active and in spiritual ways for those who are suffering in body, mind, and spirit. Another core practice of this congregation. To forgive offenses and be agents of healing and reconciliation. We often need the community to do that because in our individual relationships, in the betrayals and the hurts and the violence that many of us have experienced, we need the help of a larger group in order to practice healing and reconciliation. But we are called to do so, to bear wrongs patiently and understand that this work of healing and reconciliation takes time. Another reason why we need the support of each other in order for that to unfold. And to never forget to offer prayers for both the living and the dead. In that reading from Matthew, we hear the call to do those things. But I would say we need to go another step further and say that we need to be agents of change by working for justice and confronting the structures within our societies and our local communities that maintain the status quo of inequalities, of discriminations, of oppression and oppressive forces, and all the myriad exploitations that are around us. Sometimes we refer to these as the structures of evil or the structures of sin. Some of you may remember those words from another time in your life. It doesn't matter what we call them, they exist. And we continue to suffer in larger and small ways, in individual relationships and in communities and peoples because of that. I have hanging around the podium here a cloth from a village in the mountain areas of Guatemala called Santiago Atitlan. This is a cloth woven by the women in that community in one of the 3 congregational ministries that sustain economically the people in this village. And this multicolored cloth outlines the reality of their lives, the corn and the 4 seasons, winter, spring, summer, and fall, the spiritual life of the beauty above and below as well as all around them, the corn and the wheat and the place of worship. And it reminds us that those who have been made poor are not incapable of caring for each other, are not incapable of building communities, and are not unwilling to bear the sacrifice to be who they are and to find ways to continue. And the challenge before us is, how do we assist them? And how do we build a more just society? And from a spiritual point of view, we can talk about these values with some of a few phrases. The first one is, if you want peace, work for justice. To rise up and confront the structures. No more collusion, no more complicity. What are we doing to do that? To live simply so that others can simply live. To use less material goods, to be less focused on wealth and prestige. That's why I shared that pastoral reflection on downward mobility. To not be afraid, because God has made it very clear that we can have a particularly profound and inspired experience of God when we spend time with those made poor, when we take the risk to be with those who are suffering in body, mind, and spirit, because God cries out from their eyes and from their bodies and from their stories. And finally, to understand that this work of justice takes time, and we need to be a community as we confront these unjust systems and as we work for change, and that we need to come together in prayer and support and hold on to each other so that we find the energy to do this. And if we accept those principles, those spiritual values, then we can begin to say that our faith leads to action. And we care for those around us, but we also confront all those structures that make suffering possible. And I refer to this as the ministry of justice and liberation. Because if we truly take the risk and confront the structures of sin around us, then what we're talking about is liberation. Justice becomes an act of setting free those who have been bound up by the fear and the hatred and the violence of others. And that's a good definition of liberation. And then we also begin to understand that building that community is not something that we have to wait for in the next life, but is something that God asks us to do right here and right now. The rightly ordered community of God that we are invited to participate in, to build, and to live in is not something that comes later on, that comes in another generation, but it's something we have to attend to right now, to build this rightly ordered community right here and right now. And that is very hard for us to accept, those of us who live here in the West and in the North, because we are surrounded by such wealth and by such comfort. And maybe we're beginning to come alive because in the world around us right now, if we're paying attention to what's happening, the economic forces are changing. The economic inequality, even in our wealthy society, is widening. And maybe that's a wake-up call. Maybe that's God's way of asking us to pay more attention to the world around us. And as we reflect on the changes to our physical earth, maybe that's a wake-up call as well. And God reminding us that what are we doing to care for our common earth? You know, it's only in the West that we have this belief that property can be owned. It's only in the West that we have this belief that we can do anything we want to the property and to the land and the earth, and that's okay. If we listen to the other traditions around us, and you have tried to do that in your tradition, we have to accept the fact that that's another false and rejectable approach, and that we have to work together for our common home. Those are very challenging things to think about for us here in the U.S., right? And if we look to the communities of the South, particularly in Central America, in the 1950s and 60s, before their civil wars, where communities came together in small groups to share the land, to share the working of the land, to build cooperative environments in which the crops could be farmed and people could sustain themselves with weaving or with carving wood or making furniture or many of the other things. They also supported each other in the lives of their families, both extended and nuclear. They also prayed together, and that became a threat. Because with that education, with that kind of solidarity, they challenged the status quo. We are now the status quo. They continue to speak to us. Their faith sharing in the context of their sacred texts and their lived reality move them to go beyond just taking care of each other in the immediate suffering of their local villages, and instead to work for justice and liberation. And in that rising up, they created an enormous force for change. And they weren't always successful in making that change take hold. But that ought not to stop us from trying. And one of the biggest traps we can fall into is to say, well, there will always be poor. There will always be suffering. There will always be some who have less than others. So I'll do the best I can, and I'll take care of my family and let God worry about the rest of it. Sisters and brothers, that's not what we're called to do. Because if we look at the poverty or the racism or any of the other myriad structures of inequality and exploitation that continue to operate even within this country, we can't say honestly that God is okay with that. It's not good enough to just let it go. It's not good enough to just take care of the little sphere of ourselves. It's contrary to God's will. It's contrary to what we believe. And it's anti-human. And so this morning I wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect on these realities and to reflect on what it means to be invited into a ministry of justice and liberation. One of the ways that we can be helped by doing this is by listening to the stories of those who have survived in places of inequality and injustice, by hearing the stories of how people have risen up. I just returned from a few weeks in Central America, and I was with one of my friends and colleagues, Eva Menejava, and she shared with me a story of being in her local congregation during the Civil War, and one of her ministers being gunned down one night, and her attending to his body right after he died, taking towels to soak up the blood that was still coming from him. And rather than be in despair, to be in celebration that his ministry and his witness was strong enough and vital enough to galvanize that community, and that his work for justice and liberation led to him being sacrificed, and that in that sacrifice, other people came forward to work against those injustices. There's always a risk when we stand up for what God calls us into. There's always a risk to speak the truth and to not remain in the darkness. We won't be able to solve everything, but it's something that we work for. Because if we're working in the ministry of justice and liberation, then God will show us the way. In that mysterious spiritual way that we find strength and comfort, we hold on to each other, we ask each other for support, and we look to each other to find the ways, the resources, to push back against that which is so unfair. And that's where the pastoral meditation comes in. Have the risk to first have your heart broken when you reflect on all this suffering, and then to fall in love with those who are struggling within your own families and within communities far and wide, and then to have your lives ruined because you can't walk away from it, because you can't hide anymore. That's what those who suffer have given to me in my life and my ministry, an inability to just walk away and to push it aside and to go back to doing things the same way. In a proper embracing of justice and liberation ministry, our mission at all times is to protest against injustice, to challenge what is inhuman, to side with those who have been made poor and all who are oppressed. Think about what you prayed together this morning. Love is the doctrine of this congregation. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need. This do we affirm and covenant with each other. Love, truth, service, peace, freedom, acceptance, and the building of a right-ordered community. Sisters and brothers, that's what we are called into, fully, completely, without reservation. And we need each other in order to stay focused on this, and we need to come together in prayer and worship so that we cannot lose sight of this. So I ask you to discover your vocation as ministers of justice and liberation, to risk downward mobility, to practice those works of mercy in your own lives and in the communities around you, to choose advocacy, to say yes to solidarity, to be who you are, to teach what you believe, and to practice what you teach. And I wish you great success in this endeavor and much peace and manifold blessings. Amen.
Please stand as you are able and willing, and join in the singing of our closing hymn, number 126, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. Please be seated. Dorothy Day lived a wild youth in New York City. When the Depression came, she found religion, formed the Catholic worker movement, and worked to help the poor. During World War II, she was a crusader for peace. And in 1946, she wrote, "Love is the message." What we would like to do is change the world, to make it a little simpler for people to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves as God intended them to do. We can, to a certain extent, change the world. We can work for the oasis, the little cell of joy and peace in a harried world. We can throw our pebble into the pond and hope that the circle will reach around the world. We repeat, there is nothing to do but love. And dear God, please enlarge our hearts to love each other, to love our neighbor, to love our enemy, as well as our friend.